It was April 1945. The war in Europe had maybe 3 weeks left. The cities were rubble. The rivers were red. And somewhere in a bombed-out building in Frankfurt, a public relations officer for the Supreme Allied Command was typing a press release that would quietly, methodically, and deliberately erase the name of the man who had just saved the entire Allied advance from catastrophic failure. The man being erased had not died. He was not wounded. He was not missing. He was sitting 40 miles away, boots on his desk, reading the same telegram, and his jaw was doing something his staff had learned to fear. It was not trembling with sadness. It was not shaking with disbelief. It was locked, still, the way a steel trap goes still the moment it snaps shut. General George S. Patton set the telegram down on his desk. He did not curse. He did not throw anything. He looked out the window at the smoke rising from what used to be a German city, and he said 3 words to his aide. His aide wrote them down. He kept that note for 40 years. We will get to those 3 words. But first, you need to understand what Patton had just done, because the magnitude of what was being stolen from him does not make sense unless you understand what he had actually built, what he had sacrificed, and what he had proven against odds that every other general in Europe had declared impossible. The year is 1944. The month is July, and the Allied campaign in Western Europe is dying. Not slowly, not in a way that could be managed or massaged in the newspapers. It was dying the way a wound dies when infection sets in, spreading outward from the original damage, poisoning everything it touches. The Normandy breakout, which was supposed to be the moment the Allied armies poured through the German lines like water through a broken dam, had instead become a nightmare of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and close-quarters slaughter that favored the defenders and ate Allied soldiers at a rate that made the generals sick when they looked at the casualty reports at night. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the Bocage, was a landscape designed by accident to stop exactly the kind of armored warfare the Allies were trying to wage. The ancient Norman farmers had built these earthen walls over centuries to divide their fields, and they stood 6 feet high, packed with roots and stone, wide enough at the base to stop a Sherman tank cold. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a kill zone. Every hedgerow was another line of defense that the Germans, who had been in France for 4 years and knew this terrain the way they knew their own backyards, used with mechanical efficiency to bleed the Allied advance white. Men who had survived the beach landings were dying in fields the size of football pitches. Commanders who had studied warfare their entire careers were discovering that nothing in their training had prepared them for this particular hell. The casualty rates in some units exceeded anything seen in the First World War. And the line, the great Allied line that was supposed to have been in Paris by now, had barely moved 20 miles from the beaches where it had started. Eisenhower was worried. Not in the way that commanders get worried when a plan hits ordinary friction, but in the deeper, quieter way that comes when a man begins to suspect that the fundamental assumptions underneath his strategy might be wrong. The British under Montgomery were supposed to be pinning the German armor on the eastern flank while the Americans broke through on the west. But the breakout was not happening. The weeks were bleeding away. Supply ships were still unloading men and equipment onto the beaches, and there was nowhere for them to go because the front was not moving. The German commanders knew they were winning this phase of the battle. General Paul Hauser, commanding the IISS Panzer Corps, told his staff in late June that if the Allies could be held in the Bocage until autumn, the supply crisis, the weather, the political pressure in London and Washington, and the sheer arithmetic of attrition would force a negotiated settlement. Hold them in the mud, he said. Let the mud do what the bullets cannot. It was into this situation, this stalemate, this slowly spreading disaster, that Dwight Eisenhower made one of the best decisions of his career. He activated the Third Army, and he gave command of it to George S. Patton. To understand what this meant, you need to understand where Patton had been for the previous year and a half. You need to understand the slapping incident, because without it, the story of what followed makes no sense. November 1943, a field hospital in Sicily. Patton was visiting wounded soldiers, shaking hands, awarding medals, doing the public-facing work that commanders were expected to do when they moved among their men. He walked down a row of cots, stopping at each one, saying the things you say to men who have been shot and burned and torn apart by steel, and who are trying not to show how much pain they are in. Then he stopped at a cot where a soldier was sitting. No visible wounds, no bandages. The soldier's chart said battle fatigue, combat stress, what a later generation would call PTSD. What Patton saw was a man who was not wounded. What Patton felt in that moment was a kind of fury that had nothing to do with military logic and everything to do with the particular blindness that afflicts men who have mastered fear by refusing to acknowledge it. He slapped the soldier. He called him a coward. He screamed at him in front of nurses and other wounded men and ordered him back to the front. It was the worst thing Patton ever did in public, and Eisenhower came very close to ending his career over it. Did not, partly because Patton was genuinely irreplaceable as a combat commander, and partly because Eisenhower was shrewd enough to recognize that destroying Patton entirely would be a gift to the Germans. Instead, he was sidelined. He was used as a decoy. He was sent to England to command a fictional Army Group Patton, that existed entirely to make the Germans believe the main Allied invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. He gave speeches. He attended dinners. He reviewed troops that would never fight under him. He was, in every meaningful sense of the word, warehoused. Patton was 58 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for a moment that seemed to be passing without him. He watched the Normandy landings from England. He listened to reports of the Bocage fighting on the radio. He sat with his maps and his theories and his carefully developed understanding of armored warfare, and he watched other men implement those theories badly and get soldiers killed, because they were timid where he would have been bold, methodical where he would have been fast, bureaucratic where he would have been ruthless. He wrote in his diary things he could not say aloud. He drank more than he should have. He picked fights with his staff over things that did not matter because the thing that did matter, the chance to fight, was being withheld from him. Then came the call. August 1, 1944. The Third Army was activated. Patton assumed command, and within 72 hours, everything in Western Europe changed. The breakout at Saint-Lô, Operation Cobra, had finally cracked the German line. A corridor existed. It was narrow, contested, and dangerous, and every other commander in the Allied order of battle was treating it with the caution that narrow, contested, dangerous corridors demand. They were thinking about their flanks. They were thinking about supply lines. They were thinking about what would happen if the Germans sealed the corridor behind them and cut them off. Patton was thinking about speed. He had a theory that he had developed over years of studying cavalry warfare, mechanized warfare, the campaigns of Napoleon and Rommel and Guderian, and every other commander who had understood that speed is not just a tactical advantage, but a psychological weapon of the first order. The theory was this: a defender can adapt to anything except an enemy who moves faster than the defender can think. Get inside the enemy's decision cycle. Move so quickly that by the time they have figured out where you are somewhere else. By the time they have responded to your last position, you have already created 3 new threats that each require a response. Paralyze them with choices, exhaust them with movement, and above all, never stop. He unleashed the Third Army into the gap like a knife through water. The speed was unprecedented. In the first 2 weeks of August, Third Army advanced further than the entire Allied front had moved in the previous 2 months. They took Brittany. They swung south and east. They crossed the Loire. They outflanked German positions that were prepared to fight frontal assaults and simply drove around them, leaving them surrounded and irrelevant. German commanders who had built their defenses facing west suddenly found American tanks appearing from the south, from the east, from directions that made no tactical sense, unless you accepted that the enemy was moving at a speed that defensive planning had simply not accounted for. The German 7th Army, which had been the backbone of the defense in Normandy, found itself in a pocket, the Falaise Pocket. Patton's armor was driving northeast while the Canadians pushed south. The jaws of the trap were closing. Inside those jaws were somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 German soldiers, the armor and artillery and infantry that represented Germany's best remaining forces in the West. If the pocket closed completely, if every German soldier inside it was killed or captured, the war in Western Europe was effectively over. There was nothing behind them. The road to Germany was open. The question was not whether the Allies could win, but whether they could win fast enough to end it before winter. This is where things get complicated. This is where the story inside the story begins. This is where you have to pay attention, because what happened at Falaise in August 1944 is still argued about by military historians 80 years later, and the argument matters to everything that comes after. Patton's tanks reached Argenton. They were supposed to stop there. The boundary between the American and British sectors ran through Argenton, and Montgomery commanded the British forces pushing down from the north. Patton was supposed to wait. He was supposed to let the 2 forces meet on the line and seal the pocket from both sides simultaneously. Patton did not want to wait. He believed, and the subsequent evidence strongly supports his belief, that if he had been allowed to push north through Argenton, he could have closed the pocket himself. He had the momentum. He had the speed. The Germans inside the pocket were disorganized, demoralized, and running. They were not the force they had been in June. They were fragments, remnants, men throwing down their weapons and running east toward Germany and survival. He sent a message to Bradley. He said famously that he could drive to the German border in 2 days if they let him go. Bradley did not let him go. The decision to halt Patton at Argenton is one of the most debated command decisions of the Second World War. Bradley said later that he was worried about a head-on collision between American and British forces in the dark and confusion of a closing battle. He was worried about air support hitting the wrong troops. He was worried about overextended supply lines. He was worried about a German counterattack through the thin American corridor. These were not unreasonable worries. They were the worries of a careful man doing careful arithmetic in a situation that demanded careful arithmetic. But Patton was not a careful man. He was a fast man, and the gap in the pocket stayed open long enough for between 40 and 50,000 German soldiers to escape. They took their weapons. They took their command structures. They took their experience. And they went to Germany, where they would fight again, and where they would make the final year of the war significantly more bloody than it needed to be. Patton believed for the rest of his life that the Germans who escaped through the Falaise Gap were the men who fought him in the Ardennes 4 months later. He was probably right. But he did not dwell on it. There was no time to dwell on it. because Paris was falling, and beyond Paris was Germany, and beyond Germany was the end of the war that Patton had been waiting his entire life to fight. The Third Army's advance across France in August and September of 1944 was the fastest sustained advance by any army in the history of modern warfare. That is not a claim made by Patton's admirers. That is the assessment of military historians who have analyzed the operational records. In 30 days, the Third Army covered 600 miles. They liberated or seized more French territory in a month than the entire Allied force had taken in 2. They crossed river after river. They took city after city. They moved so fast that the supply system, which had been designed for a much slower advance, could not keep up with them. And then they stopped. Not because the Germans stopped them, not because the terrain stopped them, not because Patton ran out of ideas or his men ran out of courage. They stopped because they ran out of gasoline. This is the part that Patton carried with him for the rest of his life like a stone in his chest. The supply system, run under the authority of the Supreme Allied Command, had a formula for allocating fuel. The formula was based on projected rates of advance, and the projected rates of advance had been set before anyone had seen what the Third Army could actually do. When Patton's army advanced at twice the projected rate, they consumed fuel at twice the projected rate. When the supply system, operating on the old formula, delivered fuel based on the old projections, Third Army ran dry. The tanks stopped. The pursuit ended. The Germans, who had been on the verge of complete collapse, had time to stop running and start digging in. Patton sent message after message asking for fuel priority. He documented every request. He calculated, based on his fuel consumption and his position on the map, that he could reach the German border in a matter of days if the fuel was there. He believed, and again the subsequent evidence supports his belief, that if the Third Army had been fueled in late August 1944, the war in Europe could have ended before Christmas. Instead, the fuel went elsewhere. It went to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the audacious attempt to capture Bridges AC. Cross the Rhine and outflank the German defenses from the north. Patton watched the fuel that he believed was his, the fuel that he believed could end the war, diverted to a British operation that he did not trust and did not believe in. Market Garden failed. The bridge at Arnhem was too far. The German defenses were stronger than the intelligence had suggested. The British paratroopers who made it to Arnhem held for 9 days against impossible odds before being forced to withdraw, and the survivors came back across the Rhine in rubber boats in the darkness. And the war was not over, and the German line was still intact, and it was October. And then it was the Ardennes. December 16, 1944. Before dawn in the coldest winter Europe had experienced in 30 years, the German army launched its last major offensive in the West. 25 divisions, 5 of them armored, hit the weakest point in the Allied line, a thinly held section of the front in Belgium and Luxembourg, and hit it with everything Germany had left. The goal was to drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. Within 48 hours, an American army was in danger of being destroyed. Elements of 8 divisions were surrounded, cut off, or in full retreat. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the Belgian Ardennes, was encircled by German armor. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed there to hold the road junction, was surrounded with no air support, no adequate winter clothing, and ammunition running low. The German commander sent a formal demand for surrender. The commander of the 101st, General Anthony McAuliffe, wrote back one word: "Nuts." But the 101st could not hold forever, and if Bastogne fell, if the road junction was lost, the German advance would accelerate, and the entire Allied position in the Ardennes might unravel. The Supreme Command, meeting in emergency session, was looking for someone who could respond fast enough to make a difference. Eisenhower turned to Patton. The famous exchange at the Verdun Conference has been recounted many times, but it deserves to be recounted again because the specifics matter. Eisenhower asked Patton when he could attack to relieve Bastogne. The other commanders in the room expected the answer to be a week, maybe 10 days. You do not turn an entire army on a dime. You do not change direction of march for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of vehicles in 48 hours. Everyone in that room knew this. Patton said 48 hours. There was silence. Then there was laughter. Not mocking laughter, but the uncomfortable laughter of men who are not sure if what they are hearing is genius or madness, and do not want to commit to either interpretation. Patton had already issued the orders. He had anticipated the bulge. He had told his staff before the Verdun Conference to prepare contingency plans for a 90-degree turn north, and the plans were ready. And when the call came, he was ready, and 48 hours later, in ice and snow and temperatures that stopped vehicle engines and froze the hands of the men trying to start them, the Third Army turned north and drove toward Bastogne. It was the most difficult tactical maneuver Patton ever executed, and he executed it faster than anyone had believed possible. And on December 26, 1944, Third Army tanks broke through the German ring around Bastogne, and the siege was over. The Battle of the Bulge was not over. It would grind on for another 3 weeks in conditions that were simply brutal, cold that killed men who fell asleep in their foxholes, supply lines that froze, engines that refused to start, artillery that had to be fired on minimum charge because the propellant was affected by the temperature. But the crisis was past. The German advance had been stopped. The offensive had failed. And the man who had stopped it, who had turned an army on the road in 48 hours and driven through conditions that should have made rapid movement impossible, was George Patton. Then the spring came. Then Germany began to collapse. And then Patton did something that he believed, with everything in him, would end the war in 1945. He crossed the Rhine. The Rhine River was the last natural defensive barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. Crossing it had been the subject of months of planning. Montgomery had his set-piece operation prepared, a massive coordinated assault with airborne troops and artillery preparation, and a timetable that had been worked out to the hour. It was scheduled for March 24, 1945. Patton crossed on March 22. He crossed at Oppenheim, where his engineers found a relatively narrow stretch and threw a pontoon bridge across it in less time than the official planning had allocated for the reconnaissance. There was no artillery preparation. There was no airborne support. Patton drove to the river in the dark, watched his first troops cross, and then when he got to the other side, he stopped in the middle of the bridge, and, in full view of his staff and his engineers and the German prisoners being marched back across the same bridge in the other direction, he unzipped and urinated into the Rhine. He was making a point. Several points, actually. He was making the point that he was there, that he had crossed, that the barrier everyone had been treating as the final great obstacle of the war was behind him, and that the obstacle had not been as formidable as the planning had suggested, and that if you moved fast enough and were willing to accept risk, you did not need 2 weeks and an airborne corps to cross a river. He called Bradley. He said, quietly, before the official announcement, that he needed Bradley to know that the Third Army had been across the Rhine for 24 hours before the press release went out, because he wanted his boss to have the information even if the public did not yet. Then he said something else. He said, "This is not for the press. This is for you. I want you to know that a soldier has made it across the Rhine before Montgomery has. I want you to know that." Bradley laughed. He told Patton to keep moving. Patton kept moving. The advance from the Rhine into Germany was the final chapter of the Third Army's war, and it was fought at the same tempo that had characterized everything Patton had done since August 1944. Speed, relentlessness, maintaining pressure so constant that the enemy had no time to set new defensive lines before they were already behind them. German resistance was collapsing, but it was collapsing unevenly. There were still units, SS formations, Hitler Youth battalions, old men in Volkssturm units who had been handed rifles they barely knew how to use, who were fighting because they were told to or because they were afraid of what would happen to them if they stopped. There were still ambushes. There were still mines. There were still soldiers dying in the last month of a war that everyone knew was already over. And it was in this context, in this final push through a Germany that was simultaneously dying and still fighting, that something happened that made its way up the chain of command to Eisenhower's headquarters, and that set in motion the chain of events that would end with Patton reading a telegram and his jaw going still, and his aide writing down 3 words. You need to understand the credit structure of the Allied command to understand what Patton was facing. The supreme Allied commander was Eisenhower. Beneath him were the Army group commanders. Beneath them were the Army commanders, of whom Patton was one. The press releases about Allied victories were issued from Supreme Headquarters, and they emphasized the Supreme Headquarters perspective, which meant they emphasized Eisenhower, and by extension the overall Allied effort, and the commanders who were closest to Eisenhower's inner circle. Patton was not in Eisenhower's inner circle. He had never been in Eisenhower's inner circle. The two men had served together in the interwar years and had a complex relationship built on mutual respect and mutual irritation, and a deep divergence in temperament that made genuine friendship impossible even when genuine professional admiration existed. Eisenhower admired Patton's operational genius. He trusted Patton to do what needed to be done when doing what needed to be done required speed and audacity, and a willingness to accept risk that more cautious commanders would not take. He also found Patton exhausting, politically dangerous, and constitutionally incapable of understanding that fighting a coalition war required managing allies as carefully as managing enemies, and that a press release was not just a statement of fact, but a diplomatic document. Patton found Eisenhower overly political. He thought Eisenhower spent too much energy managing Montgomery and too little energy letting the Americans, who were doing the bulk of the fighting in the West by 1944, fight the war on American terms and at American speed. He thought the fuel crisis in September 1944 was not a logistical accident, but a political decision that favored British prestige over American military effectiveness. He thought and said in his diary, if not always in his official communications, that if Eisenhower had given him the resources he needed when he needed them, the war would have been over months earlier. These were not the views of a modest man, but they were not the views of a man who was simply vain. They were the views of a man who had spent 58 years preparing to fight a war, and who found the political constraints on that fighting to be not just frustrating but genuinely tragic. Because every day the war continued was another day that soldiers on both sides were dying for objectives that he believed could already have been achieved. When the press releases from Supreme Headquarters began attributing the Third Army's achievements to the overall Allied command without specific credit to Patton, Patton noticed. He noticed every time. He kept records. He compared what his army had actually done with what the public was being told. He was not wrong. The gap between the operational record and the public narrative was real, and it was not accidental. The telegram in April 1945 was not the first instance. It was not even the worst instance. But it was the one that arrived on a particular morning when Patton was tired, and the war was almost over, and he had spent 9 months watching his accomplishments laundered through Supreme Headquarters and returned to the public as achievements of the Allied team, with all the names blurred together, and the specific credit that he believed his men deserved dissolved into the general credit that made coalition warfare politically manageable. His aide came in with the telegram. Patton read it. The telegram announced that the Allied crossing of the Rhine and the subsequent advance into Germany had been the result of coordinated Allied effort under the Supreme Command, and it attributed specific achievements to the overall command in language that made it impossible to tell, from the press release alone, which army had done what, when, and under whose command. Patton read it twice. He set it down. He looked out the window. His aide, Major Alexander Stiller, was a man who had served with Patton for years and who had learned, through long experience, to read the general's silences the way a sailor reads the water. Some silences were thinking silences. Some were angry silences. Some were the kind of controlled quiet that preceded an explosion of the sort that made staff officers wish they had chosen a different career. This silence was none of those things. This silence was something Stiller had not seen before. It was the silence of a man who has received confirmation of something he already knew but had perhaps hoped was not entirely true. Patton turned from the window. He looked at Stiller, and he said, "I will be remembered." 3 words, Stiller wrote them down. He kept the note. Not "I will get credit." Not "someone will fix this." Not "I will fight this." Those were the words of a man arguing with the present. The words Patton said were the words of a man who had already moved past the present and was thinking about something larger and longer and harder to see from where they were standing. "I will be remembered." He said it without anger. He said it the way a man states a fact about the physical world, the way you say the sun will rise tomorrow, not as a wish, but as an assessment of how things actually work when enough time has passed for the noise to settle and the signal to become clear. Then he told Stiller to find him a map of the Czechoslovak border. There was still fighting to be done. What happened next did not come immediately. Credit disputes in the middle of a war are not resolved during the war. They are resolved, if they are resolved at all, by the long, slow work of history, by the memoirs that the survivors write, by the operational records that the historians analyze, by the interviews that the journalists conduct 20 and 30 and 40 years later, when the men who were there are old enough to say things they could not say when careers and reputations and alliances were still at stake. Eisenhower's memoirs gave Patton generous credit, more generous than Patton might have expected. Eisenhower was not a small man, and by the time he wrote Crusade in Europe, he was able to see the Third Army's campaign with the clarity that distance provides. He wrote that Patton was the outstanding combat commander of World War II. He wrote it without qualification. But that was years later. In April 1945, in a bombed-out headquarters in Germany with the war still not quite over, Patton had his maps and his armies and his certainty that he would be remembered. And he had the long, complicated knowledge that being right and being credited for being right are 2 different things, and that the gap between them is the space where bitterness lives. He chose not to live there. This is, ultimately, what separates Patton's response to the credit dispute from what it might have been in the hands of a smaller man. He did not spend the remaining months of the war fighting the public relations battle. He did not leak to journalists. He did not conduct a campaign of strategic reputation management. He did not even, for the most part, allow his anger to manifest in ways that would have been both understandable and destructive. He kept fighting. The Third Army crossed into Czechoslovakia. They liberated camps. They took cities. They processed surrenders. They did the grinding, necessary, inglorious work of occupation that follows victory and is never as satisfying as the advance that preceded it, and they did it with the same relentless professionalism that had characterized their entire campaign. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Third Army had liberated or captured territory containing a population larger than most European countries. They had taken more prisoners than any other Allied army in the West. They had advanced further, faster, against stiffer opposition, with lower casualties per mile of advance than any comparable force in the history of the war. The operational record was there. It was not going anywhere. And Patton, who had said, "I will be remembered," turned out to be correct in a way that even he might not have fully predicted. Because what happened in the decades after the war was something that public relations officers and press releases and credit allocation at Supreme Headquarters could not control. The soldiers talked. The historians wrote. The operational records were declassified. The diaries were published. The memoirs appeared. The journalists interviewed the survivors. The television documentaries were made. The books were written and the arguments were had and the evidence was examined and re-examined. And what the evidence showed was consistent and overwhelming. The Third Army's campaign from August 1944 to May 1945 was one of the most extraordinary sustained military performances in the history of modern warfare. The speed of the advance, the decisiveness of the engagements, the flexibility of the command response, the relief of Bastogne, the crossing of the Rhine, the penetration into Germany and Czechoslovakia. Taken together, they constituted a record that was, by any objective measure, without equal in the Western theater. The press releases from 1944 and 1945 said Allied forces achieved this, and Allied forces achieved that. The history books say Patton. He knew they would. Not from vanity, from the same instinct that had made him a great commander. He had an accurate sense of what was real and what was managed, what would last and what would fade, what the evidence showed and what the spin attempted. He understood that credit in the short term is allocated by the people who hold the megaphone. Credit in the long term is allocated by what actually happened. What actually happened was the Third Army. And the man who led it, the difficult, brilliant, infuriating, irreplaceable man who had been slapped out of command and warehoused in England, and used as a decoy and fuel-starved in France and credit stripped in the press releases, had said 3 words to his aide in April 1945 and had gone back to his maps. He was right, he was remembered. His aide kept the note for 40 years. When he finally gave it to a museum, the curator who received it asked him what it meant, whether Patton had seemed angry or sad or resigned when he said it. Stiller thought about the question for a moment. He said Patton had not seemed any of those things. He had seemed certain. The curator framed the note and put it in the collection, next to the maps and the citations and the photographs of a man in cavalry boots and pearl-handled revolvers who had gone to war at an age when most men were thinking about retirement, who had done things that the textbooks still struggle to fully explain, who had made enemies in the way that people who are always right tend to make enemies, and who had been right about the last thing he said to his aide on that April morning in 1945. The campaigns faded into history. The hedgerows grew back over the fields where men had died. The pontoon bridges were taken down. The cities were rebuilt. The children of the soldiers grew up and had children of their own. The world moved on the way the world moves on, continuously and without sentiment. But the record stayed. The Third Army's record stayed. And so did the name of the man who had built it and run it and refused, in the end, to let bitterness be the thing that defined him. 3 words. I will be remembered. He was. If you have made it this far, you already know what kind of story moves you. You know that the history you care about is not the sanitized version, not the version that smooths the edges and removes the conflict and turns complicated men into simple heroes. You know that the real story is harder and stranger and more true than that. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. This channel exists for people who want the version that the press releases left out. The version that took decades to surface. The version that the operational records show and the memoirs confirmed and the historians argued about for 80 years and will probably argue about for 80 more. The version that is, as near as we can make it, true.